The silent power of the samurai. The samurai did not begin their path with the sword. They began it with silence. Before they learned how to move, they learned how to be still. Before they learned how to strike, they learned how to see. And before they ever stepped into a battle, they trained their minds to remain untouched by fear, chaos, or doubt. For them, strength didn't come from the body first. It came from a quiet place inside, a space that couldn't be shaken even when everything outside was falling apart. This silent power was the samurai's greatest weapon. It allowed them to walk into danger with a calm heart. It allowed them to make decisions with clarity when others would freeze. And it allowed them to face uncertainty without losing themselves. Most people think the samurai were powerful because of discipline or technique, but their secret was much deeper. They learned how to calm the storm inside long before facing the storm outside. When you hear the word samurai, you might imagine intensity, strictness, toughness. But the truth is something different. Samurai strength wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply rooted. Their minds were trained to be steady in the same way a mountain stands steady through wind, rain, and winter. No matter what arrived, the mountain did not react. It simply remained. This is the part that modern men feel the most distance from. Today, the mind is constantly pulled in every direction. Noise from work, noise from responsibilities, noise from social pressure, noise from the phone buzzing every few minutes. Most people live in a state of constant reaction. They move from thought to thought, emotion to emotion, problem to problem, without a moment of stillness in between. This is why the smallest things overwhelm them. Their mind is already full, already stretched thin, already fragile. The samurai mind was the opposite. It was built intentionally. It wasn't allowed to fill itself with unnecessary thoughts. It wasn't allowed to follow every fear that appeared. It wasn't allowed to chase every desire. And because of that, it became strong in a way that seems almost impossible today. But it isn't impossible. It's simply forgotten. Imagine waking up with a mind that feels steady the moment your eyes open. Imagine going through your day without feeling overwhelmed by small challenges. Imagine handling pressure with the calm of a still lake. The samurai lived this way because they understood a truth that few people realize. Your external strength is only as strong as your internal silence. This is the essence of the ancient path you are about to walk, not the path of force, not the path of intensity, the path of stillness. The path Musashi followed until his final days. The path that begins by learning how to quiet the noise inside you, so the true strength hidden beneath it can finally rise. Why modern minds break. Modern life demands strength, but it rarely teaches you how to build it. The average man today faces more noise in a single morning than a samurai faced in an entire week. The constant notifications, the unfinished tasks, the silent expectations from others, the pressure to be productive, the fear of falling behind, all of this creates a mind that is constantly under attack. Not from swords, not from battles, but from thoughts. Endless thoughts that pull, push, and scatter your attention until nothing inside feels solid anymore. Most men don't realize how fragile their minds have become. They think feeling overwhelmed is normal. They think being unable to focus is normal. They think waking up tired, falling asleep anxious, and living each day with a quiet sense of failure is simply part of adulthood. But the truth is simple. The mind was never meant to hold this much noise. It never evolved to handle thousands of stimuli every day. It never evolved to be always reachable, always distracted, always processing something. This is why modern minds break. Not because people are weak, but because their environment is unnatural. A samurai could sit in a quiet room for hours without reaching for anything. A modern man cannot sit in silence for 30 seconds without touching his phone. Not because he's addicted, but because his mind is overloaded. It searches for distraction, not out of desire, but out of escape. Silence feels uncomfortable when the mind is crowded. The samurai didn't have stronger minds by accident. They lived in a world that allowed the mind to breathe. The hours of calm, the lack of constant stimulation, the deep focus on a single task, all of these built a mind that could endure fear, pain, and uncertainty without collapsing. Their strength wasn't created through sheer toughness. It was created through space, through simplicity, through moments where the mind could settle itself, like water in a still pond. Today, the mind never settles. It never rests. Even at night, the thoughts continue. The worries continue. The comparisons continue. This endless mental movement creates anxiety, tension, and exhaustion. When the mind never stops running, eventually it starts shaking. Eventually, it cracks. And eventually, the man who carries that mind begins to feel like he is failing at life, not realizing that it's the environment that is failing him. But there is something important to understand. The samurai didn't rely on the world to make their minds strong. They built their strength through intentional practice. They chose stillness. They trained it. They protected it. They treated the mind as something sacred, something that needed clarity and space to grow. And because of that, they developed a mental foundation that couldn't be shaken by chaos. Your mind can return to that place. It can regain the stillness it once knew. It can become stronger than the noise around it. But first, you must understand what weakened it and why you feel the way you do. This awareness is the beginning of rebuilding the mind you were always meant to have. Musashi's final lesson. Near the end of his life, Miyamoto Musashi withdrew from the noise of the world and walked alone into a cave known as Reigando. He was no longer the undefeated swordsman who had crushed more than 60 duels. He was no longer the warrior whose presence alone made enemies hesitate. In those final years, Musashi understood something that most never learn. True mastery had nothing to do with combat. It had nothing to do with victory. It had nothing to do with reputation. Inside that cave, he wrote his final lessons. Not for fame, not for followers, not to impress anyone. He wrote because he had reached a clarity that only a lifetime of discipline, struggle, solitude, and deep reflection can produce. The world remembers Musashi as a deadly warrior, but his final writings show a man who had transcended the very concept of fighting. He had turned the battlefield inward. He was no longer conquering opponents. He was conquering himself. These writings became the Book of Five Rings, but the words inside are more than philosophy. They are a map to building a mind that cannot be broken by fear, failure, uncertainty, or life's inevitable storms. When Musashi writes about timing, he's not just talking about sword fights. He's talking about patience. When he writes about rhythm, he's talking about emotional control. When he writes about void, he's talking about a state of mind, free from attachment, distraction, and inner conflict. Musashi's final lesson was simple yet life-changing. The mind is the true blade. If the mind is steady, the man is undefeatable. He realized that all strength begins and ends inside. Technique, strength, strategy, these are tools. But the one who wields them must have clarity. Without clarity, a sword is useless. Without calm, skill collapses. Without inner stillness, even the strongest warrior becomes fragile. Musashi understood that an untrained mind is the greatest enemy a man will ever face. Imagine a man who spent decades facing death, and at the end of it all, he tells you the real battle was never on the field. It was in the self, in desire, in fear, in hesitation, in the restless movements of the mind. Musashi's final writings were meant for the future, for men who would never fight with swords, but who would fight battles within themselves every single day. And that is why his teachings matter now more than ever. You are not here to learn how to swing a sword. You are here because your mind seeks direction. You seek identity. You seek a path. Musashi became the teacher you never had, a mentor reaching across centuries to show you how to build a mind that stands firm while the world shakes around you. This journey is not about becoming like Musashi. It is about discovering the version of yourself that he believed every man could become. His final lesson invites you to walk the same inward path, the path toward the unbreakable mind, the modern man's breaking point. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't lazy. His name could be anything, yours, mine, or someone you know, because his story is the quiet story almost every modern man lives. He woke up each morning with a tired mind. Not because he didn't sleep, but because his thoughts had been running long before the alarm rang. He felt behind before the day even started. He felt defeated before he even took his first step. Work drained him. Responsibilities pressed against his chest like invisible weights. Small tasks felt overwhelming. Simple decisions felt complicated. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who wasn't weak by nature, but weakened by a life that kept asking more than he could give. He felt the pressure to be strong, to be productive, to keep going, but inside, something was collapsing in slow motion. He had dreams once. He had goals that felt sharp and bright. But over time, they faded under layers of stress, noise, and emotional fatigue. Now he moved through his days on autopilot, doing just enough to survive, never enough to feel alive. He tried to distract himself, scrolling, watching, consuming, but nothing filled the empty space inside. The more he tried to escape, the deeper he sank into a sense of discouragement he couldn't describe. He didn't talk about it. Men rarely do. He told others he was fine. But the truth was harder. He was losing the quiet war inside his own mind. The war against doubt, against fear, against the feeling that he had somehow failed at becoming the man he once wanted to be. He tried to push through with willpower, but willpower alone eventually cracks when the mind is tired enough. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic moment. It came on a normal day. A day like any other. A day when he sat alone in his car, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. He couldn't move, couldn't decide, couldn't force himself forward. The pressure that had been building for years finally spilled over. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with a quiet realization. I can't keep living like this. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't failure. It was simply the truth rising to the surface. A truth many men live with, but never say out loud. He had spent years trying to be strong on the outside while ignoring the slow erosion happening inside. And in that still moment, something inside him whispered that he needed something more. Not more motivation, not more noise. Something deeper, something ancient, something that could rebuild him from the inside out. His breaking point wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because sometimes, a man needs to fall apart just enough to see that the life he's been living no longer serves the man he's trying to become. The moment of humbling truth. He didn't reach clarity through a dramatic revelation. It didn't arrive like lightning or with some heroic breakthrough. It happened in a quiet, almost unnoticeable moment, the kind of moment most men overlook because it feels too simple to matter. But for him, it changed everything. After that day in the car, he went home and sat on the edge of his bed. No distractions. No noise. Just the silence he had been avoiding for years. His thoughts, usually racing, finally slowed. And in that stillness, he saw something he had never fully allowed himself to face. The enemy he had been fighting was not his job, not his responsibilities, not the world around him. It was himself. His inconsistency wasn't because life was too difficult. It wasn't because he lacked time or resources or talent. It was because he had been losing battles inside his own mind before he even took his first step. He realized that every time he quit, postponed, avoided, or talked himself out of his goals, it came from the same place, an untrained mind reacting to discomfort like it was danger. And for the first time, he understood something humbling. He wasn't failing because he was weak. He was failing because he wasn't aware. He had spent years trying to control everything outside of him. Yet he had never learned to control anything inside. His fears ran freely. His doubts spoke loudly. His urges dictated his choices. His emotions pulled him in different directions. And he mistook all of this turbulence for reality when it was actually a storm created within. This realization didn't make him feel ashamed. It made him feel honest. It softened him. It quieted the harsh self-judgment he carried every day. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with me?" he finally asked, "What is happening inside me?" And that question alone created space big enough for truth to unfold. He remembered reading that Musashi had the same turning point. After countless battles, Musashi wrote that a true warrior must first conquer his inner opponent, the one made of hesitation, fear, and uncontrolled thought. Musashi understood that a man can win every fight externally and still lose internally. The character saw the same truth in himself. He saw that conquering life meant nothing if the mind remained chaotic. It was humbling because it stripped away the excuses he had built over the years. But it was also liberating, because for the first time, he understood that change was possible. His inconsistencies weren't permanent flaws. They were symptoms of a mind that had never been trained. And if the mind could be trained, then his entire life could be rebuilt from the inside out. He sat in that quiet room for a long time. Not judging, not blaming, just observing. And in that gentle observation, he felt something new. The beginning of awareness, the first step toward the man he always wanted to be. It wasn't loud, it wasn't heroic, but it was real. And real change always starts in moments like this. The soft, humbling truth that the battle has always been within. The call toward ancient wisdom. In the days that followed his moment of truth, something inside him shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a burst of motivation. It was quieter, deeper, a subtle pull, as if something far older than himself had begun calling his name. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for, but he knew it wasn't another self-help trick, another routine, or another burst of temporary motivation. He had tried all of that before. None of it lasted because none of it reached the root. He needed something bigger than tips, bigger than discipline hacks, bigger than modern advice. He needed wisdom, real wisdom, timeless wisdom, the kind that shapes a man from the inside, not the outside, the kind that has survived across centuries because it speaks to something universal in the human spirit, something that modern life has buried but never destroyed. One night, while looking for answers, he came across a name that felt strangely familiar: Miyamoto Musashi. At first, it was just curiosity. A legendary samurai, a man undefeated in over 60 duels, a warrior whose presence alone commanded respect. But the more he read, the more he realized Musashi wasn't defined by his victories. He was defined by the mind behind them. He found passages from the Book of Five Rings, Musashi's final writings, created in solitude during the last stage of his life. These weren't technical notes about sword fighting. They were insights into human nature. They were lessons on discipline, perception, timing, purpose, clarity, and the nature of inner conflict. Reading them didn't feel like studying history. It felt like Musashi was speaking directly to him across centuries, addressing problems he couldn't explain but felt deeply. One passage stood out. "Fixation is the enemy of mastery. See everything, Be bound to nothing. Those words struck him. They reflected exactly how he had been living, constantly fixated, constantly reacting, constantly bound by thoughts he never questioned. Musashi wasn't telling him how to fight with a sword. He was teaching him how to fight the mind that held him back. He read another line. You must understand that there is more than one path to the top of the mountain. He felt something soften inside. He had been forcing himself through life, believing there was only one way to be strong, one way to succeed, one way to be a man. Musashi reminded him that the path is personal, unique, built from awareness, not pressure. The more he read, the more he felt a sense of alignment, as if the ancient wisdom filled a space within him that modern life had starved. Musashi wasn't offering instructions. He was offering a path that didn't promise quick results, but promised transformation. And in that moment, something inside him awakened, a quiet determination, a desire to step into something deeper. He didn't know what the journey would demand, but he knew this was the direction he had been searching for. Something ancient had begun calling him forward, and he was finally ready to listen. The first samurai principle: remove the noise. Musashi believed that before a man can sharpen his mind, he must first quiet it. No warrior begins by adding more. He begins by removing what weakens him. Just as a sculptor reveals a statue by chipping away at the stone, the samurai revealed clarity by stripping away everything that clouded perception. This was the first principle of a strong mind. Remove the noise. To Musashi, noise wasn't just sound. Noise was anything that pulled the mind away from reality. Unnecessary thoughts, uncontrolled emotions, scattered attention, constant stimulation. He believed noise was the true enemy of mastery because it blinds a man from seeing things as they are. A noisy mind reacts. A quiet mind observes. A noisy mind hesitates. A quiet mind decides. A noisy mind seeks escape. A quiet mind finds presence. The modern man carries more noise than any warrior in history. His attention is split into dozens of fragments. His energy is consumed by trivial concerns before he even begins his day. He checks messages before he breathes. He scrolls before he thinks. He reacts before he understands. The mind becomes like a crowded marketplace, loud, chaotic, impossible to navigate without bumping into something that steals focus. Musashi understood that such a mind cannot win battles. Not the battles of war, and not the battles of life. That's why his earliest lessons instruct students to reduce before they increase, to let go before they acquire, to remove the unnecessary so the essential can rise. When the mind is full, wisdom cannot enter. When the mind is clear, everything becomes visible. This was the first teaching the character embraced. Before changing anything, before setting goals, before building discipline, he chose to simplify. He looked at the mental clutter he carried every day, the thoughts that drained him, the habits that distracted him, the emotions that spiraled without warning. He didn't try to control them all at once. Instead, he watched them with the same neutrality Musashi practiced. He began to see how much of his suffering came not from life itself, but from the clutter inside his own mind. He removed small things at first. The unnecessary checking of his phone, the constant need for background noise, the habit of jumping from one thought to another without finishing any. These weren't dramatic changes. They were gentle shifts, quiet decisions to create space where chaos once lived. And each space created a little more clarity, a little more calm, a little more room for strength to grow. Removing noise didn't solve his problems, but it revealed them clearly. For the first time, he could see the roots of his struggles instead of the symptoms. He could see the patterns behind his inconsistency. He could see the distractions that weakened him. And with that clarity came something powerful: choice. Musashi knew that a silent mind is the mind that can finally hear itself. And for the character, this was the beginning of everything. the first step toward becoming someone who is no longer controlled by the world outside, but guided by the stillness within. The discipline of stillness. For the samurai, stillness was not the absence of movement. It was the presence of control. It was the deliberate choice to stand calm in a world that constantly demanded reaction. Stillness was a discipline, a training, a form of internal strength that was often more difficult than any battle. The samurai believed that if a man could master the moments when nothing is happening, he could master the moments when everything is happening. Stillness was where their real training began. To the samurai, the mind was like water. When disturbed, the surface ripples and warps the reflection. But when calm, it mirrors the world with perfect clarity. A disturbed mind sees danger where there is none, creates problems out of shadows, and imagines threats from simple discomfort. A calm mind sees things as they are. A calm mind responds instead of reacts. A calm mind leads a man instead of following fear. Musashi trained this stillness intentionally. He would sit motionless for long periods, listening to the breath, feeling the weight of the moment, allowing thoughts to appear without being carried away by them. He learned how to observe fear without surrendering to it, how to acknowledge desire without being pulled by it, how to face uncertainty without being shaken. This was not passive relaxation. It was active self-mastery. For the modern man, stillness may feel unnatural. Overthinking has become a reflex. The mind jumps from worry to worry, problem to problem, as if movement will solve what clarity cannot. But movement without purpose only deepens confusion. It drains energy. It creates anxiety that doesn't belong to reality, but to the stories the mind tells itself. That is why stillness feels uncomfortable at first. A man sits in silence and immediately feels the swirl of thoughts he has been avoiding. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of truth. It means the noise is being revealed. It means the mind is finally being heard. And once something is seen clearly, it can be understood. Once understood, it can be mastered. The character experienced this in his first attempts. When he sat in silence, his thoughts exploded in every direction. His mind replayed past mistakes, imagined future problems, and listed tasks that didn't matter. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to move. He wanted to escape the pressure of stillness. But he remembered Musashi's discipline. Stay with the moment, even if the moment is uncomfortable. So he stayed. And slowly, something shifted. His breath softened. His thoughts continued to appear. But they no longer controlled him. They passed like clouds instead of storms. His body relaxed without him forcing it. His mind settled, not because life changed, but because he stopped feeding the noise. In that small victory, he understood something essential. Stillness wasn't about stopping the mind. It was about no longer being pushed by it. It was about reclaiming the space inside himself, where clarity could finally grow. And this discipline of stillness would become one of his greatest strengths, building the mental ground. Grounding was the foundation of samurai training. Without it, stillness had no roots, and discipline had no center. Musashi believed that a man who was not grounded was like a leaf caught in the wind, carried by every emotion, every thought, every pressure from the outside world. But a grounded man could stand firm even when storms surrounded him. He could face conflict with clarity, not panic. He could face uncertainty without losing himself. Grounding was the quiet strength beneath all visible strength. For someone who lives with anxiety, grounding feels like a distant idea. Anxiety drags attention into the future, creating fear about things that haven't happened. It drags attention into the past, replaying mistakes and regrets. It pushes the mind into a place where nothing feels stable, and the body responds as if danger is everywhere. But grounding brings the mind back to the present moment, the only place where strength can exist. The character learned this slowly. After practicing moments of stillness, He began noticing how often his mind drifted into fear. A small message could send him into a spiral. A simple responsibility could feel overwhelming. His thoughts ran ahead of him, predicting worst-case scenarios, making him feel unprepared and unsafe. But instead of running from this pattern, he studied it. He treated anxiety as a signal, not an identity. Musashi wrote that a warrior should always place his feet in the earth, meaning not physically, but mentally. A grounded mind returns to reality instead of letting imagined fears take control. So the character practiced simple grounding rituals that samurai used to steady themselves before duels, decisions, and moments of intense pressure. He started with breath, not deep dramatic breathing, but slow, natural breaths that reminded the body that it was safe. Then he placed attention on small sensations: the weight of his hands, the feeling of his feet touching the ground, the temperature of the air on his skin. These tiny anchors brought him out of panic and back into the present. They interrupted the automatic rush of fear long enough for clarity to appear. At first, it felt insignificant, too simple, too small to matter. But grounding isn't about grand gestures. It's about returning to what is real when the mind tries to escape into what is imagined. Over time, these small rituals became powerful. The more he practiced them, the faster he could calm himself. Anxiety didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled him. It no longer dictated his choices. It became a distant signal instead of a loud command. Musashi taught that a warrior moves through life with a mind that touches the earth even when the body is in motion. That is grounding, a steady internal posture that remains intact no matter what happens outside. The character began to feel this growing inside him. A quiet stability, a new center, a sense that maybe, for the first time in years, he could rely on himself. And from this new ground, the rest of the journey could finally begin. Musashi's rule: have no preferences. Musashi taught a rule that seems simple on the surface but cuts deeper than almost any other principle he wrote: have no preferences. At first, it sounds strange. Isn't preference natural? Isn't it human to want certain conditions, certain environments, certain moods before taking action? But Musashi saw something most people miss. A man who depends on conditions is a man who can be defeated by them. Musashi understood that the world will never align itself perfectly. Battles were never fought on ideal terrain. Weather was never predictable. Opponents were never convenient. If a warrior required perfect circumstances to perform well, he was already broken. His strength was conditional. And conditional strength collapses the moment life refuses to cooperate, which is most of the time. Modern men experience this every day. Even though they are not wielding swords, they feel the impulse to act only when things feel right. They exercise only when they have energy. They work only when motivation appears. They stay calm only when life is gentle. Their discipline survives in easy moments and disappears in difficult ones. Life becomes a negotiation with comfort rather than a commitment to purpose. This is why Musashi taught his students to train with all weapons, in all environments, under all circumstances. Rain, heat, cold, exhaustion, noise. Nothing was an excuse. He believed that a man should be able to act with clarity whether his body is tired, whether the environment is chaotic, or whether his emotions resist him. Because if strength requires comfort, it is not strength. The character realized he had built his entire life around preferences. He could only focus at certain times. He could only work when he felt inspired. He could only stay consistent when he was in a good mood. Without noticing, he had surrendered control of his actions to external circumstances. His life wasn't being led, it was being managed by whatever feeling arrived that day. This realization was humbling, but also freeing. It meant he didn't have a discipline problem. He had a dependency problem. And dependencies can be removed. He began small. He stopped waiting for the right moment. He did tasks when they needed to be done, not when he felt ready. He trained even if he was tired. He practiced stillness even when anxious thoughts flooded his mind. He made decisions without checking whether his mood agreed. It wasn't about forcing himself through misery, it was about teaching his mind that conditions no longer dictated his actions. Slowly, he felt a shift. He didn't become emotionless, but he became less controlled by emotion. He didn't become invincible, but he became less vulnerable to life's unpredictability. He learned to move forward even when the mind protested. And that, Musashi believed, was the foundation of resilience. Have no preferences wasn't about becoming rigid. It was about becoming flexible. A man who moves with purpose in any condition becomes a man who cannot be broken by conditions. This was the beginning of his internal liberation. Training under any circumstance. When Musashi said that a warrior must train under every circumstance, he wasn't talking about hardship for its own sake. He wasn't glorifying suffering or encouraging recklessness. He was teaching something far more practical and powerful. The mind becomes unbreakable when it learns that it can act regardless of how it feels. Most men live as conditional doers. They wait for the right moment, the right energy, the right mood, the right environment, the right motivation. They wait for comfort to align before they move. But comfort is unpredictable. Mood is unstable. Energy rises and falls without warning. And motivation, as most men discover too late, almost never arrives when you need it. If action depends on perfect conditions, then progress will always be fragile. Musashi understood this better than anyone. He trained in rainstorms, during sickness, in darkness, under hunger, in unfamiliar places, with whatever weapon was nearby. He wanted his mind to learn one truth. The body can move, even when the mind resists. A warrior who trained only when he felt ready would collapse the moment reality turned unfavorable. But a warrior who trained under all conditions became immune to circumstance. The character realized this truth the first time he pushed himself to act when everything inside him said no. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple practice session he forced himself to complete on a day when he felt tired. But the moment he finished, something inside him shifted. He didn't just complete the task. He proved to himself that he could overcome the internal resistance that had controlled him for years. He began practicing this intentionally. If the weather was bad, he still trained. If he felt anxious, he still practiced stillness. If he was tired, he still showed up. He didn't aim for perfection. He aimed for continuity. There were days when his performance was weak, slow, or clumsy. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he acted anyway. And with each small act of consistency, his identity changed. He stopped seeing himself as someone who only performed well under ideal circumstances. He became someone who could be counted on not by others, but by himself. This built a quiet confidence that no motivational speech could give him. He began to trust his own ability to follow through. That trust was the first piece of Unbreakable Mind. Musashi wrote that, "A warrior is one who does what must be done, even when it is difficult." The character learned that training under discomfort wasn't about proving toughness. It was about removing the invisible walls that had limited him his entire life. Every time he acted despite resistance, the resistance weakened. Over time, discomfort lost its power. Tiredness became a signal, not a barrier. Anxiety became a feeling, not a command. Laziness became a whisper, not a chain. And with each day of training under any circumstance, his mind grew quieter, stronger, and less influenced by the shifting moods of life. He was no longer a conditional doer. He was becoming a warrior of consistency. And that is where true strength begins. The character's first test. The first real test didn't arrive with warning. It didn't come during a dramatic moment or a planned challenge. It came on an ordinary morning, the kind where the mind feels heavy before the day even starts. He woke up feeling drained, his thoughts scattered, his motivation absent. Every part of him wanted to postpone the practice he had promised himself. He told himself he'd do it later. He told himself he needed rest. He told himself it wasn't the right day. This was the old pattern trying to pull him back. For years, this was the moment where he always failed. Not because he lacked strength, but because the discomfort felt too defining. The heaviness felt too real. He believed that action required readiness. He believed that progress depended on feeling aligned. But standing in that moment, he remembered Musashi's teaching. If you wait for the perfect moment, the moment will never arrive. So he sat up. Not with confidence, not with determination, but with a quiet decision to try. He felt resistance in his chest, not dramatic, but a tightness that whispered all the reasons he should skip today. His feet felt heavy when they touched the ground. His mind tried to negotiate with him. Just skip today. You can restart tomorrow. But he had heard this negotiation before. It was the same voice that had controlled his life for years. The same voice that kept him stuck in cycles of trying and failing, starting and stopping. He took a slow breath and chose not to obey that voice. His first test was simple. A basic practice session he had done many times. But today it felt like climbing a mountain. His body resisted the movements. His thoughts tried to distract him. His emotions insisted he wasn't ready. But he kept moving. Not fast. Not perfectly. Just consistently. Halfway through, he wanted to quit. The discomfort felt sharp enough to convince him that he wasn't built for this. His mind whispered that he would eventually fail anyway. So what was the point of continuing now? But in that moment, something profound surfaced inside him. The understanding that discipline doesn't grow through comfort. It grows through these exact moments of resistance. He pushed through the final minutes of the practice. His breath uneven, his movements clumsy. When he finally stopped, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel powerful. He simply felt present, calm, aware. He had done something he had never done before. He had acted despite not wanting to. And in doing so, he broke a pattern that had held him prisoner. This was his first quiet victory. Not impressive to look at. Not inspiring to others. But life-changing for him. It wasn't the intensity that mattered. It was the persistence. He had proven to himself that he could keep going even when his mind protested. And that small proof became the first seed of self-belief, the beginning of a different life. A life where failure wasn't defined by feeling weak, but by choosing not to try. He had passed his first test, not by being strong, but by showing up. The mind that does not move. Musashi taught a concept so subtle yet so powerful that many students only understood it after years of disciplined training. The mind that does not move. To modern ears, it sounds impossible. How can the mind not move when thoughts appear without permission? How can a man stay mentally still when life throws chaos at him? But Musashi wasn't asking his students to stop thinking. He wasn't telling them to freeze their emotions or suppress their reactions. He was pointing toward a deeper state, a mind that remains centered even as thoughts rise and fall around it. Imagine sitting in the middle of a quiet room. Outside the walls, storms may rage, people may shout, life may shake, but inside, the air remains still. That stillness is not a lack of activity. It is a presence, a groundedness, a mind that does not run toward every noise. This is what Musashi meant. Most people live with a mind that is constantly moving. It jumps from fear to prediction, from memory to imagination, from doubt to desire. One small inconvenience triggers a chain reaction of thoughts that overwhelm the senses. A single worry becomes an avalanche. A single mistake becomes a self-accusation. Overthinking becomes the default response to uncertainty. A mind that moves like this becomes exhausted. And when the mind is exhausted, even simple tasks feel impossible. The samurai understood this. They faced real danger, real uncertainty, real life or death choices. If their minds moved uncontrollably, they would panic. If their thoughts scattered, they would die. Their training required them to cultivate an internal stillness so strong that it remained steady regardless of external conditions. For the character, this idea resonated deeply. He realized he had spent years being dragged around by his own thoughts. Whenever stress arrived, his mind ran ahead, creating problems that didn't exist. Whenever fear appeared, his mind magnified it until it felt overwhelming. He reacted to every internal movement as if it were reality. He believed every anxious thought, every imagined scenario, every fearful prediction. Musashi's concept made him pause. What if the mind didn't have to obey every thought? What if stillness was possible, even while the mind kept producing noise? He began practicing this in his daily moments. When a thought appeared, a worry, a fear, an urge, he tried not to follow it, not to fight it, just to let it be. He imagined himself as a mountain, and the thoughts as the passing weather. The mountain didn't chase the wind. It didn't flinch from rain. It didn't move for storms. It remained solid, allowing everything to come and go without losing its shape. And slowly, he felt something new. A small distance between himself and his thoughts. A space he never knew existed. In that space, anxiety softened. Overthinking slowed. Fear lost some of its sharpness. This was the mind that does not move, not empty, not silent, but steady. And for the first time, he felt what Musashi had discovered. True strength begins where mental movement ends, observing without reacting. Musashi believed that the greatest skill a warrior could master was not the technique of the sword, but the ability to observe without reacting. A man who reacts instantly to every emotion is a man controlled by the world around him. A man who observes first is a man guided by clarity, not impulse. This idea was simple for the samurai, but for the modern man, overwhelmed, stressed, sensitive to tension, it is a difficult but life-changing practice. For the character, this lesson emerged during an ordinary moment. He was at work when a small conflict sparked nothing dramatic, just a misunderstanding that would normally irritate him. Someone spoke to him sharply, accusing him of something he didn't do. The old version of him would have defended himself immediately, raising his voice, letting frustration take over. He knew this pattern well. Emotion rises, reaction erupts, regret follows. But this time, something inside him paused. He remembered Musashi's teaching, perceive that which cannot be seen with the eye. This meant seeing beyond the surface, beyond the emotion, beyond the tone, beyond the immediate discomfort. It meant observing before acting, allowing the mind to stay still even when the situation wasn't. So he didn't respond right away. He breathed. He watched his own irritation appear like a spark. He noticed the tension in his chest, the quickening of his pulse, the tightening of his jaw. But instead of letting those sensations command him, he simply observed them. This was new to him. He wasn't suppressing emotion. He wasn't pretending to be calm. He was becoming aware of what was happening inside without giving it the authority to dictate what came next. The other person waited for him to snap back. They expected a reaction, but he remained still, not out of weakness, but out of strength. He chose not to rise to the level of the conflict. He chose not to feed it with his energy. In that space, his anger softened, and clarity had room to enter. He realized the other person wasn't attacking him personally. They were stressed themselves, projecting their fear and pressure onto the closest target. It had nothing to do with him. By observing instead of reacting, he saw the truth behind the moment. He responded calmly, explaining the situation without defensiveness or aggression. The conflict dissolved. The tension faded. What could have become a heated argument became nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. Walking away from that moment, he felt something powerful. He had chosen his response instead of being controlled by emotion. For the first time, he experienced emotional neutrality, not the absence of emotion, but the freedom from immediate reaction. He learned that emotions are like waves. They rise, they fall, and they pass. A man does not need to throw himself into every wave. He can stand on the shore and watch them move. This practice didn't make him emotionless. It made him steady. And with each moment of observation, his mind grew stronger, quieter, and more his own. The first glimpse of mental freedom. He didn't expect the moment to feel so subtle. He imagined mental freedom would come with some dramatic shift. A sudden silence, a wave of clarity, or a burst of confidence. But when it finally arrived, it came quietly, almost so gently that he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. He was walking home after a long day. The kind of day that used to drain him completely. Normally, his mind would replay every mistake, every awkward interaction, every unfinished task. His thoughts would race ahead into tomorrow's worries, or turn backward into yesterday's regrets. But on this day, something was different. His thoughts rose, but they didn't take over. Anxiety pressed on his chest, but it didn't swallow him. For the first time, he felt space, a gap, a moment of stillness inside the noise. It happened when someone bumped into him on the sidewalk, spilling frustration into the air with a quick insult before walking away. The old version of him would have reacted instantly, either with anger or self-blame. His thoughts would have spiraled. Why me? What did I do? What's wrong with people? But instead, he found himself simply observing. The insult passed through him like wind. It touched the surface, but it didn't enter. He paused for a moment, almost confused by his own reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. He waited for the familiar explosion of thoughts, the rise of irritation, the tightening of the chest. But nothing came. There was only quiet awareness, a gentle recognition of the moment. Nothing more. And then it happened. The first glimpse of mental freedom. He felt the world around him slow down. Not literally, but within him. He felt his breath settle into a steady rhythm, untouched by the situation. He felt his thoughts appear like small ripples instead of crashing waves. He felt a calm that he didn't force, a calm that came from the inside, not from controlling the outside. It surprised him. It humbled him. And for a moment, it filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He realized that he wasn't broken. His mind wasn't incapable. He wasn't doomed to be overwhelmed forever. The noise inside wasn't permanent. It was simply untrained. And now, through small practices, he was beginning to see what was possible. He continued walking. But the world felt different. Or maybe he did. The weight on his chest had loosened. The noise in his mind had softened. The tension he carried in his jaw, his shoulders, his stomach began to dissolve. He didn't feel powerful, but he felt free, even if only for a moment. That moment was enough. It was the first sign that Musashi's teachings were not just philosophy. They were a path he was now walking, step by step, breath by breath. And with that first glimpse of inner freedom, he knew something important. The mind can be trained, and he was finally learning how. Musashi's integration principle. Musashi believed that a true warrior could never separate the mind from the body. To him, they were not two different worlds, but two sides of the same blade. A strong mind could not exist in a neglected body, and a strong body meant little if the mind behind it collapsed under pressure. He saw the human being as one complete system: thoughts, breath, movement, posture, emotion, all interconnected, all influencing one another. To train one without the other was to build only half of a foundation. In his teachings, Musashi wrote that the body reflects the mind, and the mind reflects the body. A restless mind creates restless movement. A weak posture creates weak thoughts. A tense body creates anxious thinking. And a calm, steady body can bring calm to even the loudest mind. This was not philosophy to him. It was truth learned through battle, through hardship, through a lifetime of observing how inner and outer strength mirror each other. For the character, this principle explained something he had always felt but never understood. Whenever his mind was chaotic, his body felt heavy, tight, or drained. When he was anxious, his breathing changed. When he felt defeated, his shoulders collapsed inward. When he felt ashamed, he moved small, avoiding eye contact. His body told the story of his inner world long before his words did. And Musashi would say, "If you want to change the story, change both." The character realized he had been living as if his mind and body belonged to different people. He tried fixing his mind while neglecting his physical strength. He tried forcing discipline mentally while his body remained untrained and sluggish. No wonder his progress collapsed whenever he faced pressure. His body wasn't supporting the man he was trying to become. His mind was trying to carry everything alone. Musashi's integration principle gave him a new direction. Instead of treating the mind as something he had to battle and the body as something he had to tolerate, he saw them as partners. When he sat with stillness, his breathing anchored his mind. When he trained his body even lightly, his mind sharpened. When he practiced awareness during physical movement, mental clarity increased. Every part strengthened the other. He began small. Simple stretching, slow breathing, light physical training done with intention, not exhaustion. When he moved his body with awareness, he felt the noise in his mind quiet faster than any thought-based practice ever gave him. When he held posture with strength, he felt confidence rise without forcing it. When he trained his body consistently, his emotions became steadier, calmer, easier to manage. He understood then what Musashi had taught his students. Strength is not built in compartments, it is built through integration. And as both his mind and body began to rise together, he felt something he had never felt before. A balanced strength. A unified foundation. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fix himself. He was building himself fully, completely, as Musashi intended. Physical training as mental training. When most people think of physical training, they imagine muscles, endurance, or athletic performance. But for Musashi, physical training was not just about the body. It was a direct path into the deeper layers of the mind. He believed that the body reveals truths the mind hides. It shows you your limits, your fears, your excuses, and your strength, not through thought, but through experience. This is why he trained relentlessly. Not to perfect his technique, but to sharpen his spirit. A man can tell himself he is disciplined. A man can tell himself he is strong. But the moment his muscles burn, the moment his breath quickens, the moment discomfort appears, the truth of his mind reveals itself. Physical training exposes whether you quit when things get difficult or whether you continue despite discomfort. And Musashi valued this exposure because it showed him exactly who he was without illusion. The character realized this when he began his first simple ritual. It wasn't extreme. It wasn't impressive. He chose something small but difficult enough to challenge him daily. A short morning routine of controlled movements, breath work, and a few minutes of purposeful exertion. At first, it felt meaningless. He wasn't lifting heavy weights or running miles. He wasn't doing anything the world would applaud. But that wasn't the point. The point was to meet resistance every day and learn how to move through it. On the first few mornings, he felt his body resist the moment he woke up. His mind offered excuses before he even stood from the bed. "You're tired. You can skip today. One day won't matter. But he recognized this voice now. It was the same resistance that appeared whenever he tried to change his life. It showed up in thoughts, but it lived in the body. And he understood that confronting it physically was a way to weaken its grip mentally. He began his training slowly, breath flowing steadily, movements controlled and intentional. The discomfort arrived quickly. His muscles trembled sooner than he expected. His breath grew uneven. His stamina faded. But instead of quitting, he focused on staying present. He didn't chase performance. He didn't push for perfection. He simply stayed with the experience. And in those moments, something inside him calmed. He noticed that discomfort didn't break him. It didn't even define him. It was simply a sensation, rising and falling like a wave. The more he stayed with it, the less power it had. His mind no longer panicked when things became difficult. It watched. It breathed. It endured. This was the beginning of a new understanding. Every moment of physical discomfort was a lesson in mental strength. He finished his first session slowly, but with a confidence he had never felt before. It wasn't pride. It wasn't excitement. It was calm determination, a quiet belief that if he could meet discomfort with awareness in the body, he could meet discomfort with awareness in life. The ritual became more than training. It became a daily reminder that the mind can be shaped through movement. A reminder Musashi had known all along. Pain as a teacher. Pain was something he had always avoided. Not just physical pain, but emotional tension, mental effort, and anything that created resistance inside him. Like many men, he learned to slip away from discomfort the moment it appeared. He convinced himself that avoiding pain kept him safe, kept him functional, kept him from breaking. But Musashi saw pain differently. To him, pain was not an enemy, it was a guide. It revealed weakness, in the same way light reveals shadows. It showed what needed to be strengthened, not what needed to be feared. Musashi believed that pain teaches a man more about himself than comfort ever could. Comfort hides truth. Pain reveals it. When the body aches, when the breath shakes, when the mind protests, the real self appears. Not the version shaped by pride or insecurity, but the version shaped by honesty. What a man does in that moment reflects the state of his inner world more clearly than anything he says or believes. The character discovered this during his early training sessions. At first, pain felt like failure. When his muscles burned or his endurance vanished, he assumed he wasn't strong enough. When his breath faltered, he felt embarrassed. When his body trembled, he felt ashamed. But over time, something shifted. He began noticing that pain didn't judge him. It didn't insult him. It didn't say he was weak. It simply appeared as a signal, a sign of where his limits were. And limits were not meant to be feared. They were meant to be understood. One morning, during a particularly difficult session, he felt his legs shake under his weight. His mind immediately told him to stop. The old instinct kicked in. Avoid the discomfort. Take the easy path. But he paused. He remembered Musashi's words. The path that leads through suffering is the path that leads to mastery. He realized that if he stepped away every time pain appeared, he would never discover what lay on the other side of it. So he breathed. He stayed. He allowed the discomfort instead of fleeing from it. What surprised him was not that he pushed through it, but what he felt afterward. Not pride, not ego, but clarity. The pain became a moment of truth, showing him that he was not fragile, that he could endure more than he believed, that the limits he feared were softer than he imagined. He saw pain not as a wall, but as a doorway. A doorway to growth, depth, and resilience. This changed his relationship with discomfort. Pain became information. Fatigue became feedback. Struggle became progress. He stopped labeling discomfort as bad and began seeing it as a natural part of transformation. Every time he met pain, he met a new version of himself, one slightly stronger, slightly calmer, slightly more aware. Musashi knew that the warrior is not the man who avoids pain, but the man who listens to it. The character was finally learning that lesson. Pain was no longer an enemy. It had become a teacher, one that spoke honestly, quietly, and always in the direction of growth. The warrior of the present moment. Zanshin is often translated as remaining mind, but the meaning goes far deeper than the word suggests. To the samurai, Zanshin was not just awareness during a moment, it was awareness that continued long after the moment had passed. It was the state of being fully present, fully connected, fully attentive to life, without drifting into thought or distraction. A warrior in Zanshin could sense what was happening around him with clarity, but even more importantly, he could sense what was happening inside. For most men today, this level of presence feels distant. Their minds rarely stay in the same place as their bodies. While their hands work, their thoughts wander. While their eyes look at the world, their mind is trapped in memory or fear. While they sit in silence, their inner dialogue repeats worries in endless loops. They are alive physically, but mentally they are elsewhere, scattered, divided, unfocused. This constant mental drifting creates exhaustion. Not just tiredness, but a deep sense of being disconnected from oneself. Thoughts pull them toward imagined futures. Regrets pull them toward unreachable pasts. And in all that movement, the present moment, the only place where strength, clarity, and peace exist, slips away unnoticed. Zanshin was Musashi's antidote to this fragmentation of attention. He believed that a warrior must be fully present not only when he acts, but also when he finishes acting. After a strike, after a step, after a decision, the awareness remains. This prevented mistakes, protected the warrior from surprise, and kept his mind grounded, no matter how chaotic the situation became. The character began learning this lesson in small, subtle ways. At first, he noticed how quickly his mind jumped ahead of his actions. When he walked, he wasn't walking, he was thinking about something else. When he ate, he wasn't eating, he was planning tomorrow. When he trained, he wasn't training, he was analyzing, worrying, or imagining outcomes. His body was present, but his mind was dispersed into fragments of thought. So he chose to practice Zanshin in the simplest moments. Walking became an exercise in presence. He felt the rhythm of his steps, the contact of his feet with the ground, the texture of the air around him. Eating became a moment of attention, not rushing, not scrolling, not drifting away internally. Even washing his hands became a small ritual of awareness. He discovered that life is full of opportunities to practice presence when you stop hurrying through everything. He soon realized something profound. When he stayed present, his anxiety softened, his mind quieted, the tension in his chest loosened. The world felt clearer, slower, easier to understand. Zanshin wasn't a warrior technique reserved for combat. It was a way of living, a gentle, continuous awareness that kept him grounded in reality instead of drowning in imagination. For the first time in his life, the present moment felt like a place he could rest in. A place where he didn't have to run ahead or hide behind thoughts. A place where strength could grow naturally, quietly, without force. This was the beginning of becoming a warrior of the present moment, living without dropping your guard. One of Musashi's most subtle teachings was that a warrior never truly drops his guard, not because he is tense, afraid, or suspicious, but because he lives with a steady awareness that does not fade when the moment of action ends. This was the essence of Zanshin: alertness without anxiety, readiness without restlessness, vigilance without fear. It was the opposite of living on edge. It was living awake. Most men today live in the extremes. They are either tense and overwhelmed, or careless and drifting. They push themselves intensely one day, then collapse into avoidance the next. Their focus switches on only when pressure forces it, then switches off completely when the task is done. They live in cycles of inconsistency because their awareness rises and falls with their mood, their energy, or their environment. They drop their guard without realizing it, losing momentum again and again. Musashi understood that consistency is not built through intensity. It is built through continuity. A warrior doesn't become strong by pushing himself one moment and collapsing the next. He becomes strong by staying aware between moments, by maintaining a quiet thread of attention that carries him from action to action, day after day. This was how warriors remained reliable. This was how discipline became natural instead of forced. The character saw his own patterns clearly. He would work hard for a few days, then lose focus. He would feel inspired, then drift into distraction. He would commit to rituals, then abandon them when life became busy or stressful. His guard dropped whenever his mind wandered, leaving him vulnerable to old habits. He didn't fail because he lacked strength. He failed because he lacked ongoing awareness. So he began practicing zanshin as a daily habit, not as a technique. After completing a task, he didn't let his mind collapse into distraction. After training, he didn't rush into the next thing without a breath. After moments of focus, he carried a small sense of attention forward instead of letting it disappear. It wasn't a rigid form of discipline. It was a soft presence, like a flame he protected with cupped hands. He noticed the difference quickly. When he finished his morning training, he stayed mentally present for a few extra minutes, grounding himself before beginning his day. When he completed a work task, he didn't immediately check his phone or escape into distraction. He gave himself a brief moment to breathe, to reset, to continue intentionally. These small pauses created rhythm, and rhythm created consistency. His guard wasn't up in a tense way. He wasn't stiff or paranoid. His mind wasn't racing. Instead, he moved through the day with a sense of purpose that lingered quietly in the background. Zanshin gave him stability not through force, but through presence. Living without dropping your guard doesn't mean living in fear. It means living awake. It means carrying the thread of your intention through each moment, so the mind doesn't collapse into old patterns the moment pressure fades. It means letting awareness become a constant companion. And in that quiet continuity, he finally found the consistency he had been searching for, the character's new way of moving. As the days passed, something subtle began to change in him. It wasn't dramatic enough for others to notice at first, but inside, he felt it clearly. His movements slowed, not because he was tired, but because he was paying attention. His steps became more intentional. His posture straightened without effort. His breathing settled into a calmer rhythm, as if his body had finally found a pace that matched the steadiness he was building inside. This was the beginning of his new way of moving, not just physically, but mentally. Before, he carried himself like someone who was always rushing somewhere, always avoiding discomfort, always lost in the noise of his own thoughts. His shoulders curled forward. His eyes darted around. His walk felt hurried even when he wasn't in a rush. Everything about him reflected a mind that lived anywhere except in the present moment. But now, after practicing stillness, grounding, and zanshin, a transformation began. He didn't force it. He didn't rehearse it. It emerged naturally, as if his body was remembering something ancient that had always been inside him. He noticed it one morning when he caught his reflection in a window. He didn't look bigger or stronger. He didn't look dramatically different, but he looked settled, centered, as if his body had become the physical expression of the calm he was cultivating. His shoulders rested comfortably. His back was straight, but relaxed. His face held a neutrality that wasn't blankness, but presence. This change wasn't about appearing confident. It wasn't about projecting strength. It was about no longer fighting himself internally. His movements were no longer driven by anxiety or urgency. They came from awareness. They came from intention. They came from a quiet sense of self-respect that had slowly grown through his practices. He began walking differently. Not slowly, but purposefully. He placed each step with awareness, feeling the ground beneath him, the balance in his body, the rhythm of his breath. He didn't rush through doors or speed around corners. He moved, like someone who wasn't being pulled by invisible forces inside his mind. He moved like someone who had regained control of his inner world. Others started noticing small things. Someone commented that he seemed calmer. Another said he appeared more focused. A coworker mentioned that he carried himself differently, as if something heavy had been lifted from him. These comments surprised him, because he wasn't trying to appear different. He simply was different. His new way of moving wasn't about perfection. He still felt stress, still faced challenges, still had moments where old habits tried to return, but he didn't collapse into them anymore. He didn't lose himself in thought or spiral into panic. His awareness remained, like a steady flame that guided him through the day. This is what Zanshin looks like in a modern life, not dramatic gestures or exaggerated discipline, but subtle shifts in behavior that reveal an inner calm capable of withstanding pressure. The character discovered that transformation doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows itself not in huge achievements, but in the quiet way a man walks, breathes, stands, and chooses each moment with intention. This was his new way of moving, and it marked the beginning of a stronger, steadier version of himself. The samurai art of non-intention. Musashi taught a lesson that seems confusing at first, especially to overachievers. Do not try to win, simply avoid loss. This wasn't pessimism. It wasn't aiming low. It was the art of non-intention, a principle at the core of Hyoho, the strategy of emptiness. Musashi understood that the moment a man becomes obsessed with victory, he loses clarity. His movements tighten. His judgment weakens. His mind collapses under the weight of expectations he created for himself. Perfectionists know this feeling well. They push themselves so hard to succeed that they become paralyzed by the pressure of needing everything to go right. They set standards so high that even small mistakes feel like personal failure. They don't move freely, they move anxiously, always measuring themselves, always fearing that a single step in the wrong direction will ruin everything. Musashi saw this as a trap. A man who fights to win fights with tension. A man who fights to avoid loss fights with freedom. To him, avoiding loss meant staying grounded, aware, and composed. It meant not letting emotion disrupt skill. It meant moving from calmness instead of desperation. Victory, he knew, is often a byproduct of presence, not pressure. When the mind is uncluttered and the intention is clear, the body performs without hesitation. The character resonated with this deeply. He had spent most of his life trying too hard, trying to be perfect, trying to impress, trying to force progress. Every goal he set came with invisible pressure. Every mistake felt like a setback. Every time he missed a day or slipped in his habits, he felt defeated. He carried an internal scoreboard that kept him in constant tension. Musashi's idea of non-intention felt like stepping into fresh air after years in a crowded room. The thought that he didn't need to fight to win, he only needed to keep moving, keep showing up, keep avoiding the habits that destroyed him removed a weight from his shoulders. It meant he didn't need to push himself into exhaustion or fear. He only needed gentle, continuous effort. He practiced this by adjusting his approach. During his training sessions, he stopped aiming for perfect form or perfect performance. Instead, he focused on not quitting. When practicing stillness, he didn't fight to silence his thoughts. He simply avoided being consumed by them. When acting on a task, he didn't demand excellence, he just avoided delay. This small shift created a profound change. He no longer felt crushed by the need to succeed. He no longer spiraled into self-criticism when he didn't perform perfectly. His movements became lighter. His mind relaxed. His progress felt natural rather than forced. Musashi's art of non-intention taught him that true mastery doesn't come from chasing victory. It comes from removing the internal obstacles that prevent natural performance. It comes from staying empty enough for clarity to enter. And it comes from trusting that consistent presence, not pressure, carries a man forward. Living without openings. Musashi taught that a warrior should leave no openings. To most, this sounds like a combat principle. Keep your stance tight, your guard high, your awareness sharp. But Musashi wasn't speaking only of physical openings. He was speaking of the small, mental, and emotional gaps that weaken a man long before any opponent does. An opening is any place where doubt enters, where hesitation grows, where distraction pulls the mind away from purpose. It is any weak point that life can strike through. Most men today sabotage themselves not through dramatic failures, but through these quiet openings. The moment they say, "I'll start tomorrow." The moment they reach for distraction without thinking. The moment they let negative thoughts guide their actions. The moment they allow one slip to become a collapse. These openings are subtle. They are soft. They feel harmless. But they accumulate, and together they create a mind vulnerable to collapse under pressure. Musashi trained relentlessly to eliminate these small weaknesses. Not by becoming rigid, but by becoming aware. He believed that strength wasn't built by doing extraordinary things, it was built by removing the small cracks in daily behavior. The difference between a warrior and an ordinary man wasn't in grand actions, but in the spaces where the ordinary man loses himself. The character saw these openings clearly once he began paying attention. He noticed the moment his mind wandered into excuses. He noticed the slight delay before starting a task. He noticed how quickly he reached for distractions when discomfort appeared. He noticed how one moment of emotional weakness could undo hours of progress. These openings were not failures. They were invitations to grow. To live without openings didn't mean perfection. It meant tightening the small places where he allowed his life to leak away. It meant recognizing the exact points where he sabotaged himself and making those points stronger. It meant seeing his patterns without judgment and deciding that those patterns would no longer control him. So he began strengthening the subtle places. If he felt the urge to delay a task by just 5 minutes, he started immediately. If he sensed distraction rising, he took a breath and returned to the present. If a negative thought appeared, he didn't follow it, he let it pass like a drifting cloud. If emotional discomfort surfaced, he didn't escape into old habits, he stayed still and observed. These small actions built something larger than he expected. He realized he didn't need massive discipline. He needed fewer openings. He needed fewer places where weakness could enter. The more he reduced these small vulnerabilities, the more consistent he became. And the more consistent he became, the stronger he felt, not loudly, but quietly, steadily, deeply. Living without openings didn't make him perfect. It made him prepared. It made him resilient. It made him someone who no longer sabotaged himself the moment life became difficult. In closing the small gaps within himself, he discovered something powerful. Strength is not the absence of weakness, it is the refusal to let weakness decide your momentum. The character becomes reliable. Reliability was something he had always admired in others, but rarely embodied himself. For most of his life, he wanted to be the man others could count on, steady, consistent, grounded, yet he often fell short. Not because he lacked the desire, but because he lacked the internal strength to follow through. He made promises he didn't keep. He started routines he didn't finish. He spoke about goals more than he acted on them. And over time, this created a quiet guilt inside him, a feeling that he wasn't living up to the man he hoped to become. But the deeper he went into Musashi's teachings, the more he understood something important. Reliability isn't built through big gestures. It's built through small consistencies. It grows from the spaces where most men collapse. It strengthens in the moments where excuses used to win. It becomes part of a man's identity when he closes the openings inside himself. Little by little, he began changing. Not publicly at first, but privately, where real transformation always begins. He woke up when he said he would. He followed through on his simple training ritual every morning, even when he felt tired. He responded to tasks immediately, instead of letting them pile up. He completed what he started, even if the progress was slow. These actions didn't feel heroic, but they created a quiet internal shift. He started becoming consistent, not perfectly, but reliably. People around him began noticing it in subtle ways. A coworker mentioned that he always delivered on time now. A friend thanked him for remembering something he said weeks ago. Someone else commented that he seemed more stable, more dependable, more present. These were small remarks, but they meant more to him than praise or encouragement ever had. For the first time in a long time, others could trust his word, and he could trust himself. He didn't chase their respect. He didn't try to impress anyone. Reliability grew naturally from the discipline he practiced daily. And that reliability created a sense of dignity, a quiet, steady respect for himself that he had been missing for years. He noticed something else too. His relationships became smoother. Conversations felt easier. Conflicts were less dramatic. People treated him with more seriousness, not because he demanded it, but because he had become someone they could rely on. Musashi always taught that external respect is the shadow of inner discipline. The character finally understood what that meant. But the greatest change happened within. He no longer doubted himself every time he set a goal. He no longer feared failure before he even began. He no longer saw himself as someone who tried. He saw himself as someone who showed up, someone who followed through, someone who could be counted on not occasionally, but consistently. And that reliability became a form of strength, deeper than any physical training or motivational push. It was the strength of identity. The strength of being a man whose actions match his intentions. The strength of becoming someone he could finally respect. This was the quiet reward Musashi spoke of, the moment a man becomes reliable not to impress others, but to honor the warrior rising within himself, letting go of ego. For most of his life, he believed that strength came from holding himself together, holding tightly to his identity, his pride, his image, his need to appear composed. Like many men, he thought the ego was a shield that protected him. But the deeper he walked into Musashi's teachings, the more he realized something uncomfortable. The ego wasn't protecting him, it was exhausting him. Musashi wrote that ego blinds a warrior long before an enemy does. Ego makes a man too rigid to learn, too proud to adjust, too reactive to stay calm. Ego makes him defend illusions, instead of facing truth. Musashi believed a warrior must remain flexible like water, not stiff like brittle wood. The ego is that stiffness, the part of a man that fears change, fears judgment, fears looking weak. Letting go of ego begins quietly. It begins when a man realizes he doesn't have to perform strength for the world. He only needs to build it within himself. The character came to this realization slowly. He noticed how often he acted not from clarity but from fear. Fear of looking foolish. Fear of failing publicly. Fear of being judged. He saw how his ego forced him into battles that didn't matter, arguments that exhausted him, and behaviors that kept him disconnected from others. His ego didn't make him stronger. It made him tense. It made him reactive. It made him fragile. One evening, while reflecting on his progress, he felt an urge to prove something, to push harder than necessary, to achieve more than needed, to show that he was becoming stronger. But the moment he recognized that urge, he also saw that it wasn't coming from growth. It was coming from insecurity. It was his ego trying to reclaim control, trying to use discipline as a way to hide fear instead of transcend it. In that moment, he paused. He took a slow breath, and he let the urge pass. He realized something profound. True strength is quiet because it has nothing to prove. He didn't need perfection to validate his progress. He didn't need praise to confirm his worth. He didn't need to force intensity to feel strong. The more he let go of the need to appear a certain way, the more he began to feel genuinely calm inside. Letting go of ego felt like putting down a heavy load he didn't know he was carrying. His shoulders relaxed. His thoughts softened. His breath deepened. He no longer compared himself to others. He no longer worried whether he was behind or ahead. He no longer needed to win every internal argument. Instead, he allowed himself to simply be imperfect, evolving, present. He discovered a truth Musashi lived by. A warrior isn't defined by how he looks, how he is perceived, or how loudly he speaks. A warrior is defined by his awareness, by his discipline, by his ability to remain steady when ego wants to run wild. And in that surrender, he found something far more powerful than pride. He found peace, becoming the practice. There comes a point on any meaningful path where discipline stops feeling like something you do and starts becoming something you are. Musashi understood this transformation deeply. He believed that the highest form of mastery wasn't reached through struggle or force, but through identity, through embodying the practice so fully that action flowed naturally, without resistance, without negotiation, without internal conflict. For most men, discipline feels like a fight. Each morning becomes a battle with the mind. Every task becomes a negotiation. Every habit becomes a question. Do I feel like doing this today? They rely on pressure, motivation, guilt, or fear to move forward. And as long as discipline depends on emotion, it remains fragile. The character had lived this way for years. He forced himself into routines, dragged himself through habits, and pushed himself harder, only to eventually burn out. Every time he slipped, he blamed himself. Every time he failed, he felt shame instead of understanding. He carried discipline like a burden, instead of wearing it like skin. But Musashi's teachings revealed a different path, a path where discipline becomes effortless, not because it is easy, but because it becomes who you are. This shift began when the character stopped asking himself whether he felt like practicing. He stopped checking his mood before acting. He removed choice from the equation, not harshly, gently. He made the practice part of his identity, not part of his to-do list. And something unexpected happened. The internal resistance began to fade. One morning, he noticed that he had begun his ritual without thinking. His body moved before his mind had time to argue. His breath settled naturally. His posture straightened. His awareness sharpened not through force, but through familiarity. The practice no longer felt like a task. It felt like returning to himself. Musashi taught that a warrior should become indistinguishable from his training. The sword is not separate from the hand. The stance is not separate from the legs. Awareness is not separate from the eyes. Discipline is not separate from the identity. When practice becomes part of who you are, there is no resistance left to overcome. The character experienced this as a quiet peace. He no longer counted days or measured progress obsessively. He no longer feared losing momentum. He no longer questioned whether the journey was worth it. He simply lived it. His habits flowed inside the rhythm of his life instead of feeling like interruptions to it. The peace surprised him. He thought discipline required intensity, pressure, and force. But true discipline required none of that. It required consistency, identity, and calm. When he embraced the identity of a man who trains, he trained. When he embraced the identity of a man who remains present, he remained present. When he embraced the identity of a man who rises, he rose. And in this shift, he discovered the quiet truth Musashi had known all along. Discipline becomes effortless the moment you stop doing it and start being it. The character's quiet transformation. Transformation rarely arrives with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, in the quiet spaces of daily life. That was how his shift began, not in a single moment, but in dozens of small ones. Small choices, small acts, small victories. Each one barely noticeable alone. Yet together, they created a new version of him that even he struggled to recognize. He didn't become louder or more confident in an obvious way. There was no sudden charisma, no dramatic change in personality. Instead, he became calm. The kind of calm that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind of calm that comes from knowing he can rely on himself. The kind of calm that grows only when a man stops running from life and begins walking with it. He noticed it one evening when he looked around his room. Nothing had changed physically, the same walls, the same furniture, but it felt different. It felt peaceful. It felt like a place where he belonged rather than a place he escaped to. He realized the room hadn't changed. He had. His presence filled the space differently, because his mind no longer fought itself. He moved through his days with a steadiness that felt new. His thoughts no longer rushed ahead of him. His worries still appeared, but they didn't consume him. His old triggers lost their power. The small frustrations that once irritated him now passed over him like mild breezes. He wasn't becoming numb. He was becoming grounded. He wasn't shutting down. He was waking up. People around him began to sense it. Friends described him as peaceful, without understanding why. Coworkers said he seemed more composed. Even strangers responded differently to him, as if they could feel the quiet stability he carried. Respect came naturally, not because he demanded it, but because calmness has a way of commanding subtle authority. But the most meaningful recognition came from within. He felt proud not in an arrogant way, but in a gentle, honest way. Proud that he had shown up for himself. Proud that he had stayed with the discomfort long enough for it to transform him. Proud that he had embraced discipline without harshness and growth without force. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was living as the man he had always hoped to become. His transformation wasn't loud, but it was deep. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It wasn't sudden, but it was permanent. He experienced the peace Musashi wrote about, a peace born not from escaping life, but from integrating with it. A peace born from understanding the mind, accepting the moment, and trusting the path. A peace born from discipline practiced gently, consistently, and with awareness. He had become unrecognizable in the best possible way, not because he changed who he was, but because he finally allowed his truest self to emerge. I regret nothing, understanding the line. Near the end of his life, Musashi wrote a line that has echoed through centuries. With 50 years of experience, I have come to the conclusion that I regret nothing. To many, this sounds impossible. How can any man look back at a lifetime of mistakes, failures, losses, and painful decisions, and feel no regret? How can a warrior who lived through violence, conflict, and loneliness say such a thing with complete honesty? The answer lies not in Musashi's accomplishments, but in his understanding of the mind. Regret is born when a man clings to a version of the past he wishes he could change. It pulls his mind backward, trapping him in moments that no longer exist. Regret grows from comparison, comparing what happened to what should have happened. It grows from judgment, judging who he was, instead of understanding him. It grows from nostalgia, guilt, and the heavy belief that mistakes define a man forever. Musashi refused to live this way. Not because his past was perfect, but because he accepted it fully. He understood that every mistake shaped him, every failure taught him, every loss carved depth into him, every challenge sharpened the clarity that led him toward wisdom. Regret, to Musashi, was a misunderstanding of life. It was the mind resisting the truth that everything, even the painful parts, contributed to who he became. The character had carried regrets for years. Regrets about wasted time. Regrets about broken habits. Regrets about choices he made when he was lost and overwhelmed. Regrets about the person he used to be: reactive, inconsistent, afraid. These regrets lived inside him like weights he dragged through every day. They reminded him constantly of who he wished he wasn't. But when he read Musashi's line, something softened inside him. "I regret nothing" didn't sound arrogant. It sounded free. He realized Musashi wasn't saying he never made mistakes. He was saying he no longer punished himself for them. He no longer argued with the past. He no longer wished he had lived differently. He had reached a quiet acceptance. He did the best he could with the awareness he had at the time. And that was enough. The character began to apply this perspective to his own life. Every mistake he regretted had taught him something he needed. Every failure pushed him toward a deeper truth. Every moment of weakness brought him to the strength he was building now. Regret no longer made sense when he saw how each step, even the wrong ones, led him to this path of growth. Musashi's final teaching wasn't about perfection. It was about peace. A peace that comes when a man stops fighting with the past. A peace that comes when he honors the journey rather than judging it. A peace that comes when he realizes regret is not a reflection of truth, but a reflection of resistance. To understand "I regret nothing" is to understand freedom. The freedom to stand in the present without dragging yesterday behind you. The path to unbreakable mind. An unbreakable mind is not a mind without weakness. It is not a mind without fear, doubt, or difficulty. Musashi never taught that strength came from being untouched by life. He taught that strength came from understanding life so deeply and accepting it so fully that the mind no longer collapses under its weight. The path to an unbreakable mind isn't a straight line. It is a weaving together of every lesson, every discipline, and every moment of awareness. It begins with removing noise, because clarity cannot exist in a mind crowded with unnecessary thoughts. The character learned this when he first quieted the chaos that had ruled him for years. Without removing noise, the mind has no space to grow. Then comes stillness. Stillness is where the mind settles into itself, where overthinking loses power, where internal storms calm. Through stillness, the character learned that presence is stronger than panic, and silence is stronger than fear. And then, grounding. A man cannot build anything on unstable ground. Through grounding rituals, he learned to return to the present moment again and again, to shift from imagined fears back into reality. Grounding taught him that he was never as lost as he believed. Consistency under discomfort follows next. Musashi knew that a mind becomes strong only when it acts despite resistance. By training under any circumstance, the character discovered the truth Musashi lived by. Consistency builds confidence, and confidence builds resilience. Then comes non-reaction. Observing without reacting taught him stability. He learned how to pause in the presence of emotion, how to breathe during conflict, how to remain himself when the world challenged him. Non-reaction freed him from the chains of impulse. Zanshin remaining awareness gave shape to all of this. It turned discipline into continuity, presence into a living state, and intention into something that lasted beyond the moment of action. Through Zanshin, he became consistent, not for a day, but for a life. Physical practice connected everything. Through the body, he learned endurance. Through pain, he learned truth. Through small rituals, he learned trust. The body taught the mind what words never could, that he was capable of more than he believed. Then came identity. Discipline stopped being a battle when he stopped forcing it. When he became the practice, rather than performing it, the path became natural. Identity created ease, and ease created stability. And finally, ego dissolved. He dropped the need to prove himself. He embraced imperfection. He accepted the past. He learned to move from authenticity rather than pressure. All of these teachings merge into one truth. An unbreakable mind is a trained mind, a mind shaped by awareness, acceptance, and steady action. It does not depend on perfect conditions. It does not collapse at the first sign of difficulty. It does not run from fear. It does not cling to regrets. It moves through life with a quiet power, because it no longer fights itself. This is the path Musashi walked. This is the path the character discovered. And this is the path any man can walk, one small, conscious step at a time. The modern warrior's journey forward. When he looked back on the journey he had walked, the moments of struggle, discipline, stillness, and quiet breakthroughs, he realized something important. Nothing about him had become extraordinary in the traditional sense. He wasn't a samurai. He wasn't a monk. He wasn't a master of any ancient art. But he had become something far more meaningful. A man who understood himself. He no longer searched for motivation. He no longer chased external validation. He no longer feared moments of discomfort or collapsed under pressure. Instead, he carried a quiet strength, the kind that only grows from facing oneself honestly, repeatedly, and patiently. Walking forward, he didn't imagine a life free from difficulty. Musashi never promised that. Life would still bring uncertainty. People would still disappoint him. Fear would still appear. The world would still shift without warning. But he carried something now that he had never carried before. The ability to remain steady regardless of what arrived. He understood that being a modern warrior wasn't about fighting battles or living like the ancient masters. It was about learning how to live with awareness in a world designed to distract. It was about finding stillness in a culture that rewards noise. It was about staying grounded in a society that constantly pulls the mind away from itself. A modern warrior is not someone who seeks conflict, but someone who refuses to be controlled by internal chaos. He walked through his days with intention. Not dramatic intention, not perfection, but presence. He spoke more honestly. He reacted less impulsively. He listened more deeply to others and to himself. His actions weren't rushed. His steps weren't frantic. Even in difficult moments, he felt a small flame inside him that did not flicker the way it once did. He realized that the warrior path is not found in ancient temples or battlefields. It is found in the ordinary moments. Waking up when you don't want to, breathing through discomfort, showing up consistently, remaining calm when emotions rise, choosing awareness over impulse, choosing presence over distraction, choosing growth over fear. These small victories shape a man more deeply than any external achievement ever could. Musashi's teachings were not instructions for becoming a legendary swordsman. They were instructions for becoming whole. And the character, now walking in his new life, felt connected to that lineage, not through skill, but through mindset. He carried forward the same principles that guided warriors centuries ago. Clarity, stillness, discipline, presence, integrity. He understood that transformation is not a destination. It is a path, one that continues, one that evolves, one that requires gentle persistence rather than harsh pressure. And as he moved into the future, he did so without fear, without regret, and without the weight that once buried him. He was not perfect. He did not need to be. He was awake. He was aware. He was steady. And in the quiet strength of his own footsteps, he carried the essence of Musashi's final lesson, that the unbreakable mind is not found by escaping life, but by learning how to walk through it with calm, unwavering presence.